So joining me now from her cabin in the woods is my friend, Michelle Stirling from Friends of Science. Michelle, before we get into the meat and potatoes of all the things that we're going to talk about, we have a mutual friend with a brand new project where he tells the other side of the story. And that's why I love Marine Pools. He comes from the left. So he comes by all of this honestly. He doesn't see things through a lens of ideology, but he's got a brand new movie out. And why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, actually, I just learned about it this morning, but it sounds very interesting. He talks with a fellow named Alex Pohl, who was a green banker and decided to abandon that crazy grifter world. And he moved off to some northern spot in Sweden, only to find that they're going to put a wind farm right next to his little quiet enclave there. And so he and Marine are doing this program called Headwind. And it was slated for release at the end of September, but I understand it's going to be on YouTube September 15th. So that's this week. So yay, another Marine Pools film.
Yeah, I love Marine because he looks at the flip side, like the other side of green energy. And one of the things that I found very fascinating was when he looked at the other side of biofuels. And you and I were talking about this online last night. Mm-hmm. Marine talked about how the shift away from conventional energy, reliable energy, fossil fuel energy towards biofuels actually takes up a large swath of arable land that we should be growing local foodstuffs with. And you had told me an interesting fact that you can plot the price of corn, because it's one of those, portable foodstuffs that people in the developing world rely on. And when corn is used for biofuel, it drives up the cost of corn, and you can actually see where civil unrest is going to occur based on the price of corn.
Right. This comes from research by the New England Complex Systems Institute, NEXI as it's called. And they did quite a detailed analysis, and it began back in, I think, about 2010 when they began this project. But they were tracking world food prices, the price of corn, the biofuel program, which in the States is really huge. Corn ethanol is a huge, huge renewable product in the States, but that policy moved about 6 megatons of corn off world markets, which caused the price of corn to rise. So when we look at the refugee crisis around the world and the civil unrest, like the so-called Arab Spring, the Arab Spring was really more about the fact that food prices were going up and no jobs were available. And so this is what's happening in many places of the world. And they could actually track where the next civil unrest would be based on the price of corn. So it's a really interesting study, and they've had a number of agricultural experts check it out. So it's not just some random study that somebody came up with, one of those pseudoscience. It's ongoing. They keep tracking it.
That's crazy, because when you go to UN climate change conferences, there's so much focus on climate refugees. Oh, we're going to have climate refugees. Well, we actually don't have climate refugees. We have green energy policy refugees, in that when you drive up the cost of food, you cause civil unrest, and then people end up as part of a refugee crisis, fleeing to the first world, where the problems that are happening in their home countries, that's where these things are sort of fomented and they manifest elsewhere. So it's very fascinating to see that kind of stuff. It's one of those things that you don't think about. You think about like people in the developing world, they won't have the sort of crop yields that we do, because we're denying them fossil fuels to do those sorts of things, and they won't be able to develop their economy because they don't have reliable electricity that works at night. But you don't realize how green energy policies in the first world make the world so much more dangerously unsafe for people in the developing world.
Right. Because for you and I, so, we go and we pay a carbon tax or whatever, the price of food goes up. I mean, it's difficult. It's challenging now for many, many people. But, okay, so we don't go to a movie, so we don't buy that special thing that we saw at Bed Bath and Beyond or whatever. We abandon some of the luxuries, but, 5 or 10% increase in food costs in the developing world, that's really a burden for those people who are so poor and food insecure.
Yeah, it really becomes a choice of life or death. And I think
Yeah.
that's what leads to civil unrest. Now, I wanted to talk to you about something that, we all sort of tuned into. And for me, it was I'm watching 5 people on the stage fight over who's going to put my husband at a work faster. And that was the leaders' debate. And you wrote an interesting op-ed about what your impressions of the leaders' debate were. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, I was actually rebutting an article by Max Fawcett that was in the federally funded National Observer. And he was saying that, in the leaders' debate, obviously things like seniors' pensions and such like would be not really an issue in the future. The big essential question was about climate change. And my view was that actually I saw 5 people talking about an impossible magical thinking solution, which is net zero 2050. And if you look at the graph of total energy consumption in Canada, today wind and solar provides perhaps 3.5% of the energy. Yet all these people are talking about like, yeah, we're going to go net zero 2050. So like in 29 years, and even some people are pushing for 2030, 9 years, we're going to completely switch over our system to forms of energy generation that don't exist yet, or that are only a niche market, or that are shown to be very dangerous. Like hydrogen is not something you really want to just put in the hands of consumers. So it's a very annoying and disillusioning exercise to realize that even the moderator is so energy illiterate that they couldn't say, well, how about this fact, ladies and gentlemen? Please explain how you're going to jump over this fact. And of course, all the alternative forms of energy are all made from oil, gas, and coal. So, this is a fact, a reality check that is not being presented to the Canadian public. So it's really, really sad.
Now that you've mentioned magical thinking, I know it's sort of out of order on the things that we said that we talk about, but since you mentioned magical thinking, that I want to talk about your live stream that you did the other day about Code Red, the climate con and magical net zero thinking. And in that, you touched on something that I thought I hadn't really thought about, because in the leaders' debate, they were talking about, we have to make life more affordable and affordable housing. And for me, I thought, is today the day these people are going to make the connection between immigration levels and affordable housing? Is today the day that it clicks, supply and demand clicks for these people? It wasn't, never is. But you had mentioned in that live stream that the leaders also aren't making the connection between immigration levels and emissions. You mentioned that in there, and I thought, I've never thought of that before, but isn't that the case? You can't have a hard cap on emissions and keep piling people into the country. You have to pick one or the other, or at least have immigration levels match your innovation levels as far as greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not the case.
Right. Well, the climate activists are saying, Canada's never met a target, blah, 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 what terrible people we are. But if you look at the ratio of immigration from 1990 to present, Canada's emissions have been pretty much flat, but our population grew by 37%. And just so you know, the federal government has a plan in place called the Century Initiative. They want to bring 63 million more people to Canada. And yet at the same time, they've implemented the net zero accountability, the climate accountability law, Bill C-12, which forces us to meet targets. So, these are in direct contradiction to each other. You can't have more people coming here. And most of the people who are coming here in terms of population sources, the statistics show us that people are coming from China, the Philippines, and India. Those are the greater portion of immigrants to Canada at the present time. Now, all of those are far less emitter countries. They're far more temperate. And when people move here, they obviously have to become higher consumers of energy, greater emitters, because otherwise you die. So, these policies are working at opposition to each other, and no one's talking about it.
you'd like to get access to my show, as well as other great TV style shows too, like Ezra's Nightly Ezra Levant Show and David Menzies' Friday night show, Rebel Roundup, just go to rebelnews.com/subscribe. That's rebelnews.com/subscribe.